Hello and welcome to another episode of the Little Knowledge Podcast with me, Paul Busby, and as always with Goff Morgan. Hello, Goff.
Hello. Greetings to you. Hope you're all perky.
I'm perkier this time.
Yes, you do. You look perkier.
Well, things are working, so that always helps.
Yeah, there's a much perkier shirt as well.
A little bit. But as I said just before we started, I have worn this before. The podcast. So as they would say of the Duchess of Cambridge, I am recycling this shirt.
Yeah, I frequently think of you and the Duchess of Cambridge in the same breath. Yes.
Oh, absolutely. We're very well matched. She just doesn't know it. So how are you?
I'm okay. Getting on with it. Stuck in the house, bored.
Well, I think that's all of us are in that kind of position.
Mostly asleep. Nodding off gently in chairs as an older person is allowed to do. And I am that, taking advantage of it. Yeah, I'm getting all right, not too bad. Looking at I've got a nice thing to talk about today. Yeah, in my usual Victorian gruesome. So we've got some next Victorian gruesome coming up.
So you know what's going to happen? We're going to gather around Uncle Goff and listen to tales of blood and murder. I just want to know what's coming. I should say that we will also be poking around photographs towards the end of the property we're talking about today. I always like to do that at the end to sort of keep them watching.
Yeah.
It's very hard to keep your attention, but you can always pause and come back to it, you know.
Yeah. Hence we're going to do our posing pouch and thong special. That'll be nice.
That's your speciality, Goff, not mine. But anyway, if I said to most of the people watching Llanwern, I guess steel immediately rolls into mind, right?
Yeah, that's the thing you always think. To my shame, I didn't even realise there was a village of Llanwern until after they knocked down the Llanwern steelworks.
Oh, yeah.
That's true, because I remember saying to my father, look at the car, oh, good look, it's a sign there saying Llanwern Village. And I never even knew there was one.
Well, just to let people know where we're talking about this place. Now, can you find your way on this map, Goff? We've got Bishston Road
yes, here we are.
coming down here. And we have the church there that's going to be very important in a minute. And this here is the site of Llanwern House, which is what we're going to be talking about.
All right, yes.
So where is
as you come down that road marked Lodge Hill there, again you see straight up that avenue of trees, and you can clearly see that it's leading up to that mound in which the current building is there.
Yeah, now a farm, but where the drive used to go right into the courtyard of Llanwern House, it's now into the farmyard itself. And to give you an idea of and look at this, see what I mean when I said Llanwern Park is still pretty much intact?
Oh, gosh, yes.
I mean, there's a lot there, isn't there? But if you go down south, that's where you find the old steelworks.
Oh, right, yes, of course.
So hopefully
being redeveloped as housing now, isn't it?
Yes, a big redevelopment of Llanwern, Llanwern, by the way, one translation of it is church on marshy land.
So that's rather interesting. Because we're not far from Nash and Goldcliff and the land behind the seawall down on that side of the Usk, are we?
Absolutely. We are very near here to the Caldicot levels. So we're talking reclaimed land, essentially.
Oh, right. There we are.
But as for Llanwern itself, it first appears 982. That's the year. 982. It appears in the Book of Llandav as a church given by Morgan Hen, Old Morgan. Don't worry, Goff, no one has ever called you that yet.
It's time.
Morgan Hen was King of Glamorgan, and it was given to the Bishop of Llandav. And then ever since that moment, the bishop held land nearby, hence Bishop's Palace being at Bishop Town, which is now known as Bishton.
Yeah.
So it all sort of comes together. It's also mentioned in the Doomsday Book.
It's interesting. It's mentioned in the Doomsday Book.
Yeah, there's a little debate about it. Chris Lyes is an academic who's done a lot of work on early Llanwern and watches a few episodes of Us, apparently. So I have to give a shout out to Chris Lyes. A lot of his work I am mercilessly mining these early bits. I hope he doesn't mind. Yeah, in the Doomsday Book, it's mentioned as being held by a man called Roger de Ivory. Now, do you think that when Roger de Ivory was at home roughhousing with his children, do you think he ever tickled the Ivories?
Oh,
Sorry.
Yes. Good night, everybody.
It doesn't. It doesn't get any better, really. Now, he was the chief butler in the court of William the Conqueror.
Oh, gosh.
Until he got done for an uprising under William Rufus, who he obviously didn't think too much of. So we have that. And then for many, I'd never even heard of this family, to my absolute shame. But then it appears for many centuries, the whole place, Llanwern, was owned by a family called the Welsh Family.
The
Welsh
family.
family.
How was that spelled?
Well, they're a family from near the Somme. So it's changed. So it started D. Walsay or Walsois, and then it eventually became the Welsh family. So it's spelled as we would spell Welsh, but of course before that it was completely different spelling, pronunciation, and all the lot of it.
Oh, how interesting.
But I'd never heard of them. I mean, they turn up as sort of sheriffs of Monmouthshire in the 1560s and 1550s. This family, the Welsh family. It is what is quite interesting. Well, before we get onto the Welsh family, there is a little memorial to one of them in this church down here, St. Mary's Church, Llanwern, which must be, that site is where the Llan almost certainly comes from. Because although this church is 14th or 15th century, it's probably on the site of a much older one, which poses some questions, quite frankly.
Yeah.
It really does pose some questions because look how isolated it is.
Well, it is, isn't it? Yeah.
I mean,
it's just sort of bang on its own. It's not near a village. It's not near a major house. It's not near anything, is it?
It's very strange.
Yeah.
And that's why some people have suggested that there may well have been a village, medieval or post-medieval, around this church, which for whatever reason vanished.
Oh, right.
Now, they have found evidence of dead bodies buried outside the church walls in stone coffins and things like that. Now, maybe you do that for suicides, possibly. It's not unusual. But there are suggestions of other buildings around here. And there's a tantalizing painting. It was owned by a chap called Bradney, who was a Monmouthshire historian. And this painting is now lost. But it was sketched in 1931 by Fred Hando.
Oh.
And it shows St. Mary's Church. And it shows quite clearly other buildings around it.
Oh, gosh.
So why did this village vanish? Now, usually there's three reasons for this. Flooding, plague, or the enclosure of parkland by an aristocrat when he kicks you out.
Oh, right.
Now, I don't know.
Well, we know the plague. We know the plague has got into the area because it got into Bishton, didn't it?
It did, yes, it did.
So that's it's possible. That's a possibility that it stopped off at Llanwern on the way to Bishton. The area did suffer during plague.
It's possible, isn't it? They think it might have been there at least until the 17th century. So the Welsh family era. The Welsh family era ended when they started running out of money. And what they did was they did what you always do when you need money and you're sensible. And Anthony Welsh in the 1620s went to two loan sharks to borrow £100. They sound quite respectable, loan sharks. Sir Gabriel Pyle and Robert Shaw. Sharks Incorporated.
Yes, if they're going to break your leg, they're going to break it with a certain amount of flair and correct etiquette. That's very nice.
But of course, he couldn't pay back this £100, and it soon became a £1,000 mortgage on the entire manor.
Oh, crikey.
He ended up in Usk jail for 17 weeks, and he accused them of trying to take possession of Llanwern Park, and indeed they did. In the end, Shah did take possession of it and sold it in 1630 to a man called Lewis Van of the Cauldre. The Cauldre now, of course, the Celtic manor.
Yes, that's right.
So there must have been a building on there.
Oh, God.
But yeah, and the Welsh family, who may well have been Quakers, appear to have disappeared from this area in the Civil War era. People think maybe they went back to some of their lands in Gloucestershire and England. They seem to have left the area. The Welsh left the area.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, that again, because we've been talking a lot about the Civil War in the area. And as you pointed out, this is a very, very pro-royalist and pro-Catholic area. So, a Puritan family wouldn't necessarily be on the right side of the political divide down here, would they?
No.
So you could see them clearing off to other properties which are more favourable for them politically and religiously.
They may well have done. So the Vans took over. There was a man called Charles Van Senior who didn't seem to like spending money and didn't like to push himself out there, shall we say. He appears to have kept himself to himself, which cannot be said for his son, Charles Van Jr., who took over. And it is thought that it's Charles Van Jr. who decided to rebuild Llanwern House. And it was on a hill, so it overlooked the ancient church of St. Mary. And let me have a little look. Where are we? And we can have a look at what he built.
Is it Sir Charles Van II?
Charles Van II, yeah. He was an MP, but he didn't get a knighthood. So there it is.
Oh, right. I've seen that. Yes, I have. I've seen a similar picture.
And I know where you have seen a similar picture as well. In one of the places where you've worked, there's one a print of this on the wall.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's not a very ornamental house. In fact, in the
Very
future,
boxy.
Very boxy. One of the future people who lived here, a French governess, said it resembled a factory more than a mansion.
Yeah, you can see that, can't you?
The park was beautiful. I mean, a really beautiful plan. It still is, actually. Yeah. And inside, there are wonderful little touches as well. So when we have a look inside later, there are a few surprises. It is actually a very elegant mansion. But there it is.
I find the mound is that sort of the bump it's on is very interesting because, as you said, they were there a very, very long time. And you're right back into sort of, the Norman period as well. You wonder whether it was a site of a fortification or something at some point, because a lot of these modern Bailey castles were right on top of hills like this, physically dominating the area. And we know that this is a rebuild. So you wonder whether it was on the site of an older place as well.
It may have been. There are little marks in the ground that some with the aerial photography have found, which might have been part of the old Welsh buildings slightly elsewhere. And someone suggested the kitchen garden for this, because it had what appears to be a moat around it, might have been where a previous Llanwern house might have been.
Oh, right.
But again, who can keep track with the buildings on this site?
Yeah.
But Charles Van, who took over this, he married very well. You've got to marry well. We're learning this, haven't we?
Quite, yes.
Aristocratic game. And so he married a Morgan.
Well, whatever you want to get somewhere, marry a Morgan.
Absolutely.
I've said this myself for years. I'm still available. Anybody?
Well, he married Catherine Morgan, the daughter of General Thomas Morgan of Rupera and Tredegar. So pretty impressive. So he married her, and that immediately put him in for a chance of becoming a member of Parliament, because the Morgans of Tredegar sort of dominated the politics in the 18th century for this area. But he sort of pushed himself forward where his father certainly wouldn't. For instance, when he rebuilt this house and tried to be an MP, the magnificent Sir Charles Hanbury Williams wrote a letter from St. Petersburg and said, "Nothing surprised me more than the flights of young Mr. Van. He clearly takes after his mother. Good God, if old Van was to hear that his son stood for a county," expensive, you see, "and kept 13 bay coach horses, he would rise out of his grave to disinherit him."
Oh, my blimey.
But he did stand, and he stood impossibly and lost. And then he stood again, and the Morgans, not very familial, the Morgans supported his rival. Which is something. But he finally got into Brecon in 1772. Yeah. Now, I've got to say that someone has written a paper saying Charles Van, something like political principle or character. Now, so I might be mean here, but what I know about Charles Van, the MP, is that his speeches in the House of Commons were met with merriment.
Oh, well.
Now, were they laughing with him, or were they laughing at him? And he was viciously, outrageously anti-American. His helpful suggestions during the American War of Independence, which the House of Commons just laughed at, was to destroy Boston, because that's where the locusts are, and burn down the forests of Massachusetts.
Oh, for heaven's sake. Yeah, Now, they weren't laughing with him, were they?
We've lost at least 2 viewers that we know live in Massachusetts right
Yes,
now.
yeah. Yeah, he got no idea of the actual scale of the woodlands of Massachusetts, is he? No,
He was going to go in there with a packet of matches and see what happened.
Yeah, and a determined look on his face.
So that was Charles Van. Oh, by the way, this house, I didn't say when it was built. Now, most people think it was built in 1760. But Chris Lyes found a document at the Gwent Record Office, which suggests that it was built for £15,000 in the suitably date of 1776.
Oh, right.
So it's either 1760s or 1776.
Yeah.
Not entirely sure which.
Yeah.
But a nice house, I think you'll agree.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
The Vans left. His daughter, don't worry, we won't go into begats. I know what it's like. His daughter married a baronet from North Wales, from Clwyd, called Sir Robert Salisbury. And he thought, well, do I stay in North Wales or do I go to in South Wales? And now I've got a Morgan connection. That might be a way into Parliament. And so he came to South Wales and straight away became a member of Parliament. Sir Robert Salisbury, yes. Oh. And he owned an awful lot of land around here. But he always did as he was told. He got patronage for other people, but never for him. So when the Morgans made him MP for Monmouthshire, he said that was good. But when the Morgans wanted the seat back, he said, all right, I'll move and I'll go to Breconshire instead. He did what he was told.
Yeah, it's very handy.
He unfortunately did what he was told when the Prime Minister, Spencer Perceval, wanted a politician, an MP, to do something unpopular. There was a reformer MP called Francis Burdett, who had done something that the Speaker of the House of Commons decided he should be arrested for. And so they had to find someone who would actually put forward the motion. Very unpopular. Yeah. So Robert Salisbury, would you put forward the motion? And because, yes, I will. They chased him out of town. A howling mob.
Gosh, never. Well,
and he retired to Llanwern House as his sort of sanctuary.
Good God.
He got involved in banking, and that's when it all went wrong. Terribly, terribly wrong. A man working with him was called Robert Jones, that they later worked out was a terrible embezzler. His bank failed, and Robert Jones sent him a letter, which still exists, suggesting that straight away they need to find £25,000. That's way over £1 million in today's money. So Sir Robert Salisbury doesn't know what on earth he's going to do. So he decides he needs to find someone rich, someone warm-hearted. He needs a lifeline. So he decides to approach. Where are we? You'd have thought I could have got used to this by now. He decided to approach this man, Sir Charles Morgan of Tredegar.
Yeah.
Which, of course, he had a kinship with. Originally, Sir Charles said no, but eventually he agreed and gave him a loan of £25,000.
Good grief.
I mean, how rich was Sir Charles Morgan that he could just hand over? You know,
yeah, that's astonishing, isn't it?
Enormous.
Hand over $1 million, equivalent of $1 million.
On the proviso, it would save the Salisbury Bank and he would pay it back within 3 months. 3 years later, it hadn't been paid.
Yeah.
And it was starting so, and there are letters between Sir Charles Morgan and his cuddly agent, Mr. Thomas Prothero. And Prothero has clearly suggested that they seize Llanwern House and all the furniture to get it back. But Sir Charles doesn't really want to do that. He gets some of the Salisbury land instead. You see, Llanwern House was on a 99-year lease from the Tredegar estate at this point.
Oh, right.
So he could have just seized it.
Yeah.
But he decided not to.
Oh, that's interesting.
In the end, there was about £5,000 still left, and they still thought, should we go in and kick out the widow? But luckily they didn't. I say widow because unfortunately Sir Robert Salisbury ended up in debtor's prison, King's Bench debtor's prison, which last appeared in these videos with Valentine Morris of Piercefield, who ended up there as well.
Oh, gosh.
So the Salisburys...
Good company.
Extraordinarily good company. There's another little look at the house. A little sketch of the time when the Salisburys owned it. The Salisburys continue to own it, by the way. But one of the last ones to live there was the Reverend Sir Charles Salisbury, who, as a rector, and he owned the living. Quite a handy job on his doorstep.
Oh yeah, quite. Yes, nip down to church.
So he lived at Llanwern.
Do your Sunday, then pop home back up the hill. Yes, been well.
Do your Sunday and then pop back up the hill. And this is his church, still there today, St. Mary's.
Yeah.
A pivotal building in the area, of course. But history suggests if you're rector at Llanwern, it could be problematic at times, because in the 1620s, the rector of Llanwern was a man called Ambrose Mostyn, who was once pelted with dead hedgehogs. I don't know how or why.
Yeah, and how do you get your hands on that many dead hedgehogs? Was there a sort of barrel of them to hand?
Well, clearly there must have been.
Yeah, quite.
But it must have been great. He was an antiquarian as well. And his niece was superb at creating stained glass. And she created stained glass window, which sadly no longer exists in St. Mary's Church, of her uncle as the prophet Abraham. Oh. So as he's there, giving a sermon on a Sunday, making sure all his servants are here. It should be known, if you take Llanwern House out of it, the population of Llanwern itself in the 1860s was 7.
Oh,
so again, why have they got a church so substantial?
Oh, quite.
Yeah, the vanished village.
So basically, the entire church would have been filled mostly with his servants, because there would have been more than 7 servants in Llanwern House.
Exactly.
So you basically more than triple the congregation by filling it with your own household staff. That's astonishing, isn't it?
Yeah, well, you know how some aristocrats sort of in the morning would come down the stairs and they would start prayers.
Yeah.
Well, I guess the Reverend Sir Charles Salisbury would just march them to the church. You couldn't miss church, though, could you? He'd soon spot if the butler hadn't turned up on a Sunday.
Yeah, that's astonishing, isn't it? Well, how utterly bizarre.
Yes, but it's a shame about the dead hedgehogs. But it's around about this time in the late 19th century that I think it's time that we sort of sit cross-legged.
At the knees of Uncle Goff.
At the knee of Uncle Goff. And he will tell us a tale which will curdle.
Well, gather, children, because again, this is a tiny little village, as we talk about, but with a surprising reputation for murder. There's quite a lot of it going on. Well, quite a lot of unquestionable deaths is the best way to describe it. There was an instance of a local lady, Lady Lyes Waters, married to Henry Waters, who was found dead in a ditch. That's what you do. And that got it again, not in the papers. Usually you hide. It was such a popular place to be murdered that people would pop out from Newport on a day trip to have a look, to check it out. Because it was very picturesque, apparently, very picturesque place to be murdered. As we mentioned before, with Llanwern Hall, murder was a great source of entertainment for the Victorian society, who were, to a greater extent, starved of sensation and stuff. So real crime, and particularly real local crime, would draw out all these very, very sort of ghoulish behaviour within the local population, but which was smiled upon really by the police. The police didn't seem to be at all worried that people were trooping all over the area. But for our purposes, we have a death in at Llanwern Hall. When the local MP at the time, who owned it now, I can't quite remember his name. Let me just check this up.
Something like Carbutt, isn't it? There are lots of MPs who leased it after the Salisburys left.
Yeah, local Mr. Carbutt. When he was away, the house was looked after by a custodian, which was actually the gardener, a Mr. Joseph Reed, and his wife, Mrs. Reed, who they never give the names to anybody's wives in these stories either. It's totally misogynistic. As long as you had the husband's first name, you were okay. So they were looking after this house. But the house at that point, there was adjacent tenant farms owned by a Mr. Richard Waters, who was managing the farm. And he put up a local tramp and his wife, a young man, 25, named William Cranbourne. And Cranbourne was basically working on the farm as a farm labourer, and they just put him up in one of the hay lofts on the adjacent stabling to the mansion. So you don't even have a proper place to live. You're just living in the hayloft with your wife while you're working in there. But Cranbourne had a terrible habit of getting roaring drunk. So they apparently Reed had spoken to him a number of times about causing several sort of disturbances with the wife, because he was a bit aggressive and violent with his wife. And on one occasion, they'd gone in. He tried to intervene. He'd gone up into them and said, "Look, you can't calm this down," and didn't. And it just went on and on and on. And then the local constable, a PC Porter, who was doing his rounds, came up to the house. And one of the statements in the papers, it says he had put a letter under the door. Constable Porter. Now, I wonder whether they used to do that to mark that they'd check the property during their rounds. It's never explained. It's sort of understood. Yeah, it's just sort of understood. I was pushing the letter under the door, where Reed got him and said, "Look, we've got to be going on. Can you intervene with this couple that are arguing in the hayloft?" So they go into the hayloft. They can hear all this barney and shouting going on. And then there's this, the PC Porter describes, what is a description of the sound of a woman being strangled.
Oh.
That's a very unpleasant thing. So they get up the stairs to this thing. They open the hatch. They're going to be locked with wire somehow. Don't know how that was working. So they get up into the loft, and Cranbourne immediately charges at them, saying, "You've got no rights to come here. I've got permission to stay here. You should not be here." And basically threatened to break both their necks by shoving them down the stairs if they took a step further into the loft. Obviously, as a police constable, he doesn't back off. So PC Porter goes in, and they try to reason with him, and eventually Cranbourne just charges at him, and they get into a huge sort of rolling fight on the floor, which goes on a scuffle, as it was referred to. And eventually the PC Porter pins Cranbourne down and more or less sort of just sits on him for 10 minutes until he's calmed down, at which point Reed says, "Right, that's it, I'm having you out. You're out of here tomorrow." So he's going to kick him out. So eventually Cranbourne calms down. His wife then appeals to Porter not to arrest him, because under the excuse that it was only a drunken brawl.
Right.
No lovely excuse. So it's only a drunken. And surprisingly, Porter does just go, "Oh, forget it," and sort of lets him off. So there's no, can't see it happening today again. So Porter calls out to Mr. Reed and doesn't get any answer. So he goes back down stairs and goes up into Mrs. Reed, because he wants to check with Mr. Reed how he can actually come around and get rid of this bloke the day afterwards, make sure that he's off the premises. At which point Mrs. Reed says she hasn't seen him. She hasn't seen his husband. So it's about 5 or 6 minutes. So they don't know where he is. So they go out, they try to look, to find where Reed is. Can't find him anywhere. They head back up into the hayloft, at which point they reach Cranbourne running down the stairs, shouting that there's a man lying down in the hayloft. So they go in, and there is Reed lying flat on his back in the hayloft with his head on a plank under the base of the skull, stone dead.
Mm.
Well, again, this does look terribly, terribly suspicious, doesn't it?
Just a little bit.
Yes, you've got a roaring drunk about to be thrown out of a place, and next thing you know, there he is, this bloke's on the floor. So they question Cranbourne. Cranbourne says he didn't know, he didn't see him even lying there until after they'd left. They call in the officials, they come in, doctors come in, they don't find any marks on the body to indicate there was a fight. Porter points out that he wasn't struck during the struggle, because he was basically the only one he was holding Cranbourne down, so they certainly wasn't fighting. He wasn't struck at that point. And he heard him speaking while he was sitting on him. So we don't know again what's going on there. So eventually they come up. They say the body is taken off, and they do the usual thing. They go straight down to the local pub later on and call an inquest, because whenever you seem to have a battle, an inquest at this point, you just sort of went to the nearest local pub and got in it. I'm trying to find the name of it.
Well, it is the nearest communal area, really, isn't it?
Well, it does. It always happens, but it seems very strange to us that would happen. Is that you call the inquest in the?
Yes, you wouldn't plop a corpse on the table of your nearest Weatherspoons, for instance.
No, no, not unless it's a particularly busy night. Yeah, inquest upon the body. Now, again, the papers, this is another thing you must always read about newspapers. But my grandmother said, God bless her, born in 1896, never believe everything you read in the newspapers. They've got the name of Reed completely mixed up in different papers. So it's either called Richard Reed or Joseph Reed. But mostly, in most of the articles, he's referred to as Joseph Reed. So that's where I'm going to. So he was 42, and it took place at Milton Hotel, Llanwern, 2 o'clock on a Saturday afternoon. Now, did you say that there's a Milton House? Milson?
Yeah, there is a Milton. It's it's 17th century, I think, or maybe even slightly earlier, which is near Llanwern House. So maybe that was a hotel. I haven't looked into that.
I wonder, that'd be fascinating, wouldn't it, to see if it is that place still exists. Might be a little worrying for whoever currently lives in Milton House to realise that it was used for at least 2 inquests, to my certain knowledge. So they get it, and obviously people come in and they do a lot of the various things. And this is where the papers get very, very strange. Obviously, they go through all that I've talked about, exclaiming the state of what's going on, that there was, the struggle lasted a number of minutes. There was no indication of what was going on. They knew he had been in ill health. He was given to fainting. At one point, he passed out on the way back to the house and was dragged back on a hurdle by two local worthies. But his wife said he'd actually been very well. What is a lovely little history, said he was perfectly well. He had actually just taken some people around the house from Newport who would come out on a day trip.
Oh, like a tour guide.
Like a tour guide, exactly, because that's what happened. Another thing, in these places, you would turn up at the housekeeper's room, or in this case to the custodian, slip them a bob or two, give it as a perquisite, and they would then show you around the property. So he'd actually done that in the morning before all of this kicked off. He'd taken he'd done a tour guide job and taken them around the house. So obviously they call into the coroner a Dr. Conk. That's his wonderful name.
Dr. Conk?
Dr. Conk, Conke. Dr. Conk, MRCS, who's does the autopsy. And the papers go into absolutely gruesome detail. I mean, really more than you get at the moment. And they write down, this is what Dr. Conk says: I made the post-mortem examination upon the body of the deceased on Friday. On the back, there were a number of discolorations, but no bruises. On opening the head, I found that the vessels of the brain were very much congested, and there was every indication of the deceased having suffered from inflammation of the membrane of the brain. I've
got to remind myself when I put this video up on YouTube to click not suitable for kids. Sorry, Goff, carry on.
In opening the chest, moving on, I found the results of an old pleurisy and an enormously large heart, but not of a fatty degeneration. The heart was as large as a child's head. Oh my goodness me. Really talk about wallowing in it. But basically, after all this sort of stuff, he is convinced that he died, he had a chronic heart disease. He had a number of hangovers from pleurisy, problems with inflammation of the brain, and he said any excitement can more or less finish him off.
Oh.
So it is simply bad luck at the end of the day that he passed out and he fell back and whacked his head, and he was probably dead dead in minutes. He simply died. So Cramden didn't really help himself by, as soon as they discovered he's dead, as soon as the policeman's gone, he and the lady wife rush out the building quickly. Quick, we're leaving. Where are we going? To Redwick. We're going to Redwick. It's okay. So they head off back, because he came from Chepstow area. So they keep heading back towards Redwick, which one get instantly pounced on in the middle of Llanwern. So he doesn't look very good for him, because he does look as if he is in fact fleeing the scene of the crime, But no, there were no marks. It was simply, he said, the coroner pointed out to the jury that it is evidence that the deceased had died from congestion of the heart and brain. Death might easily be accounted for by the immense size of the man's heart. So there we are. Death. The verdict was death from natural causes, but he did look very, very shaky.
Oh, I bet the suspect was relieved.
At one point, but he didn't get off. He got remanded in prison, sent back to prison, because they decided they were going to try him for attacking PC Porter.
Oh, which he did do, in fairness.
Which he did do, yeah. So Porter was going to let him off, but after all this, get out to realise obviously they couldn't let him off from attacking a policeman. So he gets. I haven't found out what actually happened to him, but I should imagine he got a final period in prison, I think, for doing that. So yeah, it's an interesting little view of the world in many respects, about not only that how the advancement has come on in forensic medicine. I mean, looking at it as they're applying quite good terms of it. There's still not much idea of a scene of crime thing going on.
Well, no, not quite.
They're pretty, we know at a period where, pathology and everything is respectable science, and you're not actually sort of being accused of cutting people up and stopping them going on to heaven afterwards. So it's a very interesting process.
Well, I'm relieved
in a way that justice was deserved. It wasn't a murder. It was sadly a case of bad timing and some very, very sensational press.
And as far as you said about the post-mortem, did the doctor examine whether there was any evidence of dead hedgehogs being thrown at the suspect?
Yeah, I don't think there was any indication of hedgehog contusion. No, I think you were all right there. It's a small bruise with lots of little spikes on it. Yeah, wow. No, there weren't hedgehogs. Hedgehogs were not involved. Hedgehogs were as innocent as Crandon on this occasion.
Well, we are ready. I think we're ready for our final MP to live at Llanwern House. Saved the best till last, really, because in 1887, this chap moved in. He was described as being. He always shaved very closely. He was very trim and very.
Just very neatly shaven, the physique.
Yes, well, this is David Alfred Thomas, affectionately known as D.A. to all that knew him.
Oh, yeah.
And D.A. Thomas became one of the great coal and industrial barons. He was born in Aberdare, and he eventually, his father made a little bit of money. He was a grocer first, and then he went into coal. But D.A. Thomas made a fortune out of coal. He owned newspapers. He had interests in the United States of America as well. He owned land in Pennsylvania, which he wanted to exploit for coal, but didn't get round to it in the end. A lot happened in D.A.'s life. He didn't like public speaking particularly, which is a bit of a drawback for a
member of Parliament.
And he had a sort of love-hate relationship with David Lloyd George. He was a Liberal MP, was D.A. Thomas. And Llanwern House became a sort of a liberal centre. So Lloyd George would turn up there, and liberal fetes and fundraising would go on there. And D.A. became the MP for Merthyr boroughs. Yeah. So he was, and then for about a year for Cardiff as well. But he was for Merthyr boroughs was his main thing. At one point, he owned a dozen collieries, which meant that he was essentially in control of a fifth of all of Britain's coal.
Good heavens.
This is an extreme, but he's not just wealthy. Yeah. He is an extremely talented man. He is an extraordinarily hard-working man. And he married a wonderful woman as well. And this is Sybil Haig. It is the same Scottish family as the Field Marshal, Sir Douglas Haig. Yeah. But Sybil was a pro-feminist, pro-suffrage, but of the moderate wing. Yeah. It said, however, that she spent every night praying that their only daughter, Margaret, would grow up to be a feminist.
Oh, God, marvellous.
Poor Sybil sort of gets overshone by her husband and her daughter. Yeah. But when you actually read the letters and the evidence, a lot of the best ideas tend to come from Sybil.
Oh, interesting.
Sybil Haig Thomas, as she was known. She was very happy when the daughter, Margaret, went on a suffragette procession to Hyde Park.
Oh, no.
But the reason why Sybil went along with her daughter sums up her personality marvelously in just this one thing. She said she did not think an unmarried woman should walk unchaperoned through the gutter, for one. Yeah. And two, I agree with her. Those are the two reasons.
Yeah.
Fair enough. And the daughter of D.A. and Sybil, Margaret, here she is.
Sure.
Margaret Haig Thomas. Now, again, this is she has no small talk whatsoever. So the biggest nightmare of Margaret's life was the 3 seasons she was shoved out into society.
Oh, gosh.
The debutante ball and all of, it was, she just couldn't handle it. So she headed up to university for a while, but then came back and decided her main sanctuary was Llanwern, where she said her father's study was the most sacred place. where D.A. Thomas was working. And Sybil said, well, why don't you employ Margaret as your secretary? Which is what he did.
Oh, right.
And there's one wonderful quote. D.A. Thomas said, well, we're not exactly father and daughter. We're butties.
Oh, that's really nice. And it's a lovely Welsh Values word as well, isn't it?
It is, and that could have a dear boy.
Yeah, we're butties. And that's great, isn't it?
Margaret was completely lost. She married a man completely ill-suited. She married a Humphrey Mackworth. The Mackworths used to live at the Priory in Killeen. They were a Killeen family.
That's good.
But even in their wedding picture, they stood apart.
Oh.
And it's true to say that the most meaningful relationships in Margaret's life were with women.
Oh,
I mean, for the last 25 years of her life, she lived with a lady, a fellow editor, a literary editor. But she found her calling. D.A. Thomas, actually, her dad at Llanwern one day got her to give a public speech. Didn't say he was going to do it, made her daughter do it, sink or swim. Sometimes she swam. Other times she went to Merthyr and she was pelted with tomatoes and herrings.
Oh.
Clearly the hedgehog collection was around.
Was it the hand? Yeah.
Herrings.
Herrings.
But she also helped run Newport's suffrage shop, which was on Stow Hill.
Oh, I never knew that. That's
and
fascinating.
later moved to High Street, the old Westgate offices, I think it was. And she ran that. So she really got into it. And she said, when I found suffragism, I suddenly had a meaning in life. I came to life again. She had an amicable divorce from her husband. And she sort of found her calling, a cause bigger than her own self-interest. And she did all sorts of things that her husband would have disagreed with. For example, she ran at Prime Minister Asquith's car, jumped on the running board, and then promptly forgot to shout anything at him. So it just looked like a very well-dressed rich lady jumping on his running board, which can't be a terrible thing to the Prime Minister.
Conning a lift.
Conning a lift, exactly. But how far do you go? They weren't making the progress they needed. And in 1913, Margaret, who was always far more of a militant suffragette than her mother Sybil, for instance, decided that she was going to, well, really do something to get arrested, because that's how you got the publicity. And she's a very well-known woman. You know, she is the daughter of an extremely rich member of Parliament, D.A. Thomas. So what she does is she decides she's going to set a pillar box on fire, post box on fire, I should say. And pharmacists who were sympathetic to the suffragettes' cause would sometimes produce what could only be described as mini bombs. Test tubes where when you poured it all together, you would have a little mini explosion. So,
good Lord,
she decided to choose a post box because no one would get hurt. Didn't want to hurt anyone.
No.
She just wanted. By this time, Mrs. Pank.
But destroying the Royal Mail is illegal, isn't it?
She wanted to get arrested.
Yeah. So she was doing something was called, but it certainly was arrestable, but not necessarily, not life-threatening.
Her mum and dad were behind her with this. I mean, Mrs. Pankhurst stayed at Llanwern.
Oh gosh.
So what Margaret did was she got this concoction in London, and for the first time in her life, she travelled third class back on the train to Newport. Where she decided she would make this stand. And there was a terrible moment on the train when a lady sat next to her leaned on her bag, the bag containing the combustible. So she said, she admitted she was scared stiff. She said she almost lost her nerve. But the post box she decided to use is still there. It's Risca Road, Newport, and there's the post box.
Oh, good heavens. Blimey.
So Margaret Thomas went up to it, or Mackworth as she was then, and she popped it inside, and sure enough, smoke started to billow from here, and she headed off. It was soon put out with the loss of 13 letters.
Disgraceful.
13 letters, disgraceful. And she was arrested. And the fine, she refused to pay the fine, so she went to prison. Usk jail. She went to Usk prison and she went on a hunger strike.
Oh, gosh.
For 6 days. And then much to her and then they released her. They had what was called a cat and mouse act, whereby if they were on a hunger strike, they would release you until you'd eaten something, then rearrest you. So they, that's the game they were playing. The cat and mouse act. So they released Margaret, but to her frustration, someone paid her fine.
Oh.
Now, it may have been her husband, it may have been her dad.
Yeah.
Someone paid her fine, but she became quite famous for this act. And indeed, she was close to getting a statue in Cardiff, but there's also talk of something in Newport. They want a statue of Margaret Haig Thomas to go up in Newport, which would be quite a nice idea, I think.
Yeah, I think that'd be splendid, wouldn't it? That's a lovely idea.
So she continued with her dad, and they needed to go to America in 1915 because he had business over there, newspapers, all sorts. And by now, she was doing a lot of the work, She was, and so Margaret and DA headed off, did a bit of work, and on the way back, they were aboard this ship, which is the Lusitania.
Oh, for goodness sake!
It's quite a sparky
Zelig moment, isn't it?
It's quite a sparky one. Yeah, and in fact, we've got her account of what happens when U-20, I think, is it U-20, U-boat 20, hit the Lusitania off the Irish coast. And I just love the way she describes this, if you'd indulge me for a second. There was a dull, thud-like, not very loud, but unmistakable explosion. It seemed to come from a little below us and about the middle of the vessel on the port side. That was the side towards the land. I turned and came out of the lift. Somehow the stairs seemed safer. My father walked over to look out of a porthole. I did not wait. I had days before made up my mind that if anything happened, one's instinct would be to make straight for the boat deck. It is a horrible feeling to stay under cover, even for a few moments in a boat that may be sinking. But that one must control that and go first to one's cabin to fetch one's lifebelt and then onto the boat deck. She's still thinking. As I ran up the stairs, the boat was already keeling over.
Oh my goodness.
As I ran, I thought, I wonder I'm not frightened. And then I'm beginning to get frightened. But I mustn't let myself. My cabin was on B deck, some way down a passage. On my way, I met a stewardess. By this time, the boat had keeled over very much, and as we each ran along, holding the rail on the lower side of the passage, we collided and wasted a minute or so making polite apologies to each other. Sorry, no, after you. Not terrible.
I don't know. To put out that's oh, bless her.
Now, her father, D.A. Thomas, had made it onto a lifeboat. Margaret didn't.
Oh.
She was hurled into the water.
Oh, my goodness.
Now, when the news filtered back to Britain, not that far away, this is off the Irish coast, one of D.A. Thomas's supporters and friends said, "Oh, don't worry with D.A. He's bound to come up out of the water with 2 large fish in each hand." And indeed he did. He was fine. And fortunately, Margaret was rescued as well. And they had an emotional reuniting.
Gosh.
And then they headed off to Llanwern and to London. So they survived the sinking of the Lusitania. Now, remember, the Lusitania, 1,198 passengers and crew died.
Oh, yeah, terrible.
So they had a very lucky escape indeed, I think you'll agree.
Oh, good Lord, yeah. I mean, you wind up in the water as well. I mean, really, your chances of surviving in water is very short because of you just die of exposure.
Yeah.
That's what killed an awful lot of people from the Titanic sinking, was exposure rather than anything else. D.A.
Thomas had a little chuckle to himself when he saw one of the placards that were out for the newspapers in Newport and beyond, because the placard read something like, "Great disaster, great national disaster, D.A. Thomas saved." Isn't it brilliant?
That does sound like an Argus headline, doesn't it?
Now he did relax a bit, a little bit, because he bred Herefordshires, so hence the cows here. The last person he shared that passage with dear old Lord Llangattock, which some of our viewers might remember from the Hendra video.
Yes, quite.
It all overlinks. It all links up, these videos, don't they? And there he is, and there they are with this. But any paradise at Llanwern was going to be completely punctured forever, because the First World War meant Lloyd George needed D.A. Thomas's talents, and he brought him into the cabinet.
Oh, right.
A huge workload D.A. Thomas had,
Yeah.
because he made him, well, first of all, he was given a title, Lord Rhondda. So he became Lord Rhondda, Baron Rhondda. He made him the president of the local government board, and he was in charge, the Minister for Food Control. So DA brought in rationing, and he is sometimes known as the man who fed the country during the Great War. And all this is being run from Llanwern Park.
Yeah, that's just astonishing, isn't it? That's amazing. Good Lord.
It's the local history that we are sometimes ignorant of.
Yeah, I mean it's a major national contribution, though, that isn't it?
It is a major national contribution. I'm afraid to say it possibly killed him, because he became very ill, heart disease. He was under a lot of stress. I mean, see what he's been through already, surviving the Lusitania, working all hours, did a superb job. He tendered his resignation, but the Prime Minister didn't accept it because he was too valuable. So he carried on working at Llanwern, and eventually he died, not before they bumped him up to Viscount, so he became Viscount Rhondda. There he is with Sybil. And he died on the 3rd of July, 1918 at Llanwern at the age of 62.
Oh, gosh.
And Lloyd George said, well, it was a great loss. And in fact, King George V did an almost unprecedented favour for him, because they only had a daughter, right? They only had Margaret. And so the king gave permission, and David Lloyd George arranged it, by now Prime Minister, that his title of the Viscountcy could pass to Margaret.
Oh, gosh, that's interesting.
So Margaret became Viscountess Rhondda.
Oh, that's fascinating, isn't it? Yeah.
So again, it's all kind of new stuff. So they lost him, sadly. But it has to be said that Margaret continued. By the way, Sybil lived until 1941, and she continued living at Llanwern. Llanwern didn't see as much of Margaret as it used to, because she had a lot on her mind. She took over most of his companies, which for a woman to do that was highly unusual.
Yeah.
In fact, she was the director of 33 companies. 33.
Blimey.
27 of which she'd inherited from DA.
Yeah.
As she said, it was always a woman. It was always Margaret and all these men on the board. And she said, I tried to fit in by wearing dark clothes and smoking excessively. I'm not sure quite how effective that was, but that's what she did. Yeah. But her passion, the feminist flame, was still in there. One slight problem was she wasn't allowed to sit in the House of Lords, even though she was a peeress in her own right as Viscountess Rhondda. And the man that stopped her was F.E. Smith, who was Lord Birkenhead. He was a close friend of Churchill. F.E. Smith is the man, if there's a witty quotation politically, it's probably F.E. Smith. It's probably Lord Birkenhead. But he liked the idea of the House of Lords of being one of the last gentlemen's bastions. And so he was Lord Chancellor, and he made sure that she couldn't get in. But she did start her real passion. I mean, she did lots of things. I mean, she was in charge of the Women's Industrial League. She set up all these things for women's rights. She created the 6 points that she thought females should at least have. I mean,
that's rather interesting.
It's very Chartist.
A 6-point charter. Yes, I'm going to say down here. It's a very Chartist influence, that one, isn't it? You can see that.
It's not an exaggeration or my bias in saying that Margaret, Viscountess Rhondda, was perhaps, in the interwar years, Britain's foremost feminist. I won't say she was the Germaine Greer of the day, but she was extremely well known. And her love, her passion, was her own weekly newspaper she set up called Time and Tide, which would push her political and feminist view. And she got people.
It waits for no man as well.
Right.
That's the nice use of that. The end of that piece is interesting.
And she got Virginia Woolf to write for it, Dorothy L. Sayers, G.K. Chesterton, Aldous Huxley, D.H. Lawrence. I mean, a lot of very talented. Didn't make any money.
No.
I mean, at one point, it was losing £400 each month from her own pocket.
Oh, right.
But it was her passion.
Yeah.
And she was determined to carry on with it. She made the distinction in 1945 of being on the Nazi list of people who must immediately be arrested if the Nazis invaded Britain.
Oh, blimey.
So that's pretty good, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's pretty good.
She's on the right side of that argument. Yeah.
She's absolutely on the right side of that argument. And also, of course, she's not at Llanwern very often. And this is, so what do you do with it? I mean, she's pooling all her money into her political cause and into Time and Tide, which eventually ended in 1986, by the way.
Oh,
So, a long run.
yeah.
So she carried on with this. So what do you do with it? After the war, we lost a lot of houses. You just couldn't afford to keep them up. The world had changed.
No.
Colebrook House in Abergavenny was lost. Aberdare House was lost in 1945. And Llanwern House was lost as well. The decision was finally taken. During the World War II, troops were billeted there. And it has to be said that, a pipe, James Lee's mill of the National Trust went there, and a pipe had burst and no one had fixed it, and water was coming in the mansion. So, in fact, she offered it to the National Trust in 1943, and the National Trust said no.
Oh, dear me.
So it's lost. So what happened was, 1952, it was announced that Llanwern House would be demolished, blown up actually by the Royal Engineers as an exercise.
Oh, good grief. That's an astonishing end to a building. It doesn't just fall down, it just gets blown up.
It gets blown up. But we've got, they took photographs before they blew it up, really.
Yeah.
So let's have a little look. Let's have a little look through it. Here's the door to Llanwern.
Oh.
And here we are. So inside, it's a very tasteful building. Look at the Chinese style ceilings. Very large rooms.
That's enormous, isn't it?
Bit of the ceiling is being lost there. Up the back staircase for the servants. That's the tradesman's entrance.
Yeah.
This, I believe, is the billiards room. This comes back to something that I said. A billiards room. Her parents were married in a billiards room in Radnorshire. You couldn't get married in a snooker room, could you?
No, not really. No, billiards. It's terribly better quality games than.
It's all Colonel Mustard and.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
So it gives you an idea of the house, and this is what it was in before they destroyed it.
Oh God! It's pretty intact, though, isn't it?
Well, compared to some of the places.
Compared to some of the places we've seen, I mean, it was certainly not beyond saving, was it?
No, this is Lady Rhondda's bedroom.
Oh gosh!
And there's a view from the reverse there, from the back. This is the estate office, which was built next to the house.
No.
And there's the bell. The estate bell has 1760 written on it, which is why perhaps some people believe the house was built then. But again, Chris Lyes believes he's found evidence it was 1776.
Yeah.
Now, the house is gone, very sadly. Llanwern. It's now got a farm on it, as we said and as we showed at the beginning. This is a portrait of Margaret, Viscountess Rhondda. In 1958, she died at the age of 75. And a few months later, women were allowed into the House of Lords.
Oh dear.
But she did win one victory because her portrait is now in the House of Lords. And it's staring at her across the way. In the same room is Effie Smith, looking furious.
Good.
And her poor dad is in the tea rooms.
Is he?
So that was Llanwern.
Well, I'm just absolutely astonished that it was blown up. I just cannot get over that fact. I mean, if you look at the interiors of that building, I mean, good grief.
It looked pretty special.
It was, it might have been struggling, but it was far from lost, was it? It was just.
It was the time. I mean, we lost a lot of houses. But it has to be said, the house destruction did tail off in the 60s.
Yeah.
Just the 40s and 50s, there was, oh my gosh, this is an albatross.
Yeah.
Destroy it. We've got to destroy it. Who would want this? Well, we would have wanted. Can you imagine what they do there now? It'd be some kind of center of suffragette history or something.
Oh, yes. Well, quite, yes. I mean, maybe that's why we had a little discussion about this, about whether the stories that we tell survive without the house. Now, obviously, these stories we told have survived without the house, but they're not as well known as some of the other stories that we've told, which are still associated with the houses. And that's really quite an interesting thing to ponder on, isn't it?
I agree.
You know, again, because I mean, I've been eye-opened about how significant, particularly Viscountess Rhondda was. in the 20th century, and she's just invisible around you.
Yeah,
and
well,
that's astonishing.
it's an interesting point. I'll put in the description below a link for the Viscountess Rhondda statue appeal, if you wish to have a little look. And also I'll give you a link to Chris Lyes' work on early Llanwern. And also there's been a very good recent biography done in 2014 of Margaret Rhondda. So I'll pop that below. Your comments are welcomed. Do join the conversation and do like and share the video and subscribe if you'd like to, because we do appreciate every like, every share, and every comment. So thank you for joining us. Thank you, Bob.
That's all right. It's been a pleasure. I've thoroughly enjoyed finding out about them. That's been great fun.
Great. And we shall see you all soon. Bye-bye.